Verity has always been one of those horror characters who gets more unsettling the longer you think about him. And at first glance, he doesn't look like the kind of entity that should become the center of endless theories. He's a floating yellow face with a friendly smile, introducing himself like the newest software update nobody remembers downloading. If you showed someone a picture of him without context, they'd probably assume he was some harmless mascot designed to teach kids multiplication. Then you learn what he does, how he behaves, and more importantly, what he doesn't explain. And suddenly that cheerful little grin starts looking like one of the most disturbing expressions in Minecraft horror. The funny thing is that everyone focuses on the ending. They remember the countdown. They remember the transformation. They remember the chase. But I think the biggest mystery surrounding Verity has always been everything that happens before those moments. The real horror isn't the monster you eventually see, it's the one you've unknowingly been talking to for hours while believing you're completely safe. That's where today's lore rabbit hole starts, because the more you examine Verity's behavior from the beginning, the stranger the entire story becomes. Think about his introduction for a second. He doesn't ask for permission to exist. He doesn't spawn through some ancient ritual. Nobody summons him with a cursed item buried beneath bedrock. He's already there, floating in your world like he belongs. That's a detail people brush past way too quickly. Minecraft is a game where almost everything has a reason for appearing. Villages generate naturally. Mobs have spawn conditions. Structures exist because of world generation. Verity completely ignores those rules. He's simply present, almost like the world expected him to be there before you ever joined. That tiny detail changes everything because it suggests Verity isn't invading the world. He's part of it. Maybe he always has been. Maybe players simply never noticed until it was already too late. Even stranger is how comfortable he acts. Most horror entities either hide in the shadows or immediately try to terrify you. Verity doesn't seem nervous. He doesn't act like someone trying to blend in. He behaves like customer support on their first day, calmly answering questions and offering assistance with absolute confidence. That's an incredibly strange personality for a monster. Usually villains want control through fear. Verity earns control through convenience. Every useful answer creates trust. Every correct direction makes you rely on him a little more. It's psychological manipulation disguised as good service. Imagine if your GPS started giving perfect directions for months before casually mentioning it already knew where you'd be next Tuesday. That's the kind of escalation Verity specializes in. Everything starts reasonable enough that you ignore the tiny cracks forming underneath the surface. Then, there's the question nobody asks enough. How does Verity know everything? It's easy to shrug and say he's supernatural, but even supernatural entities usually have limits. Verity doesn't simply know where ores are located. He knows personal information. He understands events outside the game. He responds with confidence regardless of the topic. That opens up a bizarre possibility. What if Verity isn't gathering information in real time? What if he already has it before you ask? That idea turns him from an intelligent creature into something significantly more unsettling. Knowledge stops being a power and starts becoming evidence. Evidence that he's observing far more than the player realizes. Another strange moment comes when the abandoned village appears. On paper, it's a simple scene. The player reaches an empty settlement and asks what happened. Verity avoids the question, saying only that something passed through. It's easy to interpret that as mysterious dialogue designed to build suspense, but there's another possibility. Maybe Verity isn't avoiding the answer because he wants suspense. Maybe he's avoiding it because the truthful answer would expose him immediately. Think about it. If something passed through and nobody survived, who would know exactly what happened? Either a witness or the thing responsible. That's an uncomfortable thought because Verity never sounds surprised by anything. He's never curious. He's never confused. Every response comes instantly, almost like someone reading documentation they wrote themselves. The abandoned village suddenly stops looking like a random location and starts resembling a crime scene where the murderer volunteered to guide the investigation. Then we reach the countdown. 3 days. Most people assume the countdown exists to build tension, but why 3 days specifically? Why not 1? Why not a week? The number itself is strangely deliberate. 3 days gives enough time for hope to exist while guaranteeing panic eventually replaces it. Day 1 is confidence. You think you have plenty of time. Day 2 becomes preparation. You reinforce every weakness you can find. Day 3 becomes desperation because the deadline is no longer theoretical. Verity understands human behavior with frightening accuracy. He knows exactly how people respond to certainty. Give someone a vague warning and they'll ignore it. Give them an exact deadline and they'll obsess over every second. The countdown isn't mercy. It's another weapon. The player spends those days building walls, gathering resources, placing traps, and convincing themselves survival remains possible. Meanwhile, Verity repeatedly reminds them none of those preparations matter. That's such a cold form of psychological warfare because he's attacking the player's confidence instead of their health bar. By the time the final day arrives, exhaustion has already done half the work for him. Another piece of lore worth examining is Verity's appearance. Everyone remembers the transformation into the towering humanoid figure with the massive grin, but look closely at what stays the same. The smile never disappears. The color palette barely changes. The identity remains recognizable. It's almost like the original floating face wasn't a disguise. It was an unfinished version of the same creature. That's important because disguises usually disappear completely once they're no longer needed. Verity evolves instead. It's as though you're watching something mature into its final state rather than reveal a hidden one. That raises another possibility. What if the countdown isn't for the player? What if it's for Verity? Maybe those 3 days are the time he needs to become whatever he ultimately turns into. Suddenly, every interaction beforehand feels less like manipulation and more like incubation. You're not surviving until the monster arrives. You're spending 3 days beside the monster while it finishes becoming itself. That's a horrifying reinterpretation because it means the player isn't waiting for danger. They're living with it. Another mystery sits in the background of the story, almost unnoticed. Why does Verity answer questions at all? If his goal is simply killing the player, helping them locate resources seems unnecessary, unless helping serves another purpose. Maybe every question reveals something about the player. Think about how conversations naturally work. The questions people ask expose priorities, fears, and habits. Someone asking where diamonds are thinks differently from someone asking how to reach a village. Verity doesn't simply answer questions. He studies them. Every interaction becomes another puzzle piece. By the end of the story, he doesn't merely know where the player is, he understands how they think. That's an entirely different level of manipulation. You're teaching him without realizing you're the lesson. Then there's his confidence during the final confrontation. Most horror monsters become aggressive because they're desperate. Verity never feels desperate. He behaves like someone following a schedule. That calmness suggests the outcome was never uncertain from his perspective. He doesn't chase because he hopes to win. He chases because he already knows how the story ends. That's terrifying because it removes the possibility of improvisation. The player spends 3 days creating variables. Verity acts like every variable has already been calculated. Imagine playing chess against an opponent who knows every move you'll ever make before the match even begins. That's the kind of certainty Verity projects. It makes resistance feel symbolic instead of practical. One detail I keep coming back to is the phrase, "you could've." When asked whether the coming disaster was preventable, Verity doesn't say no. He doesn't say yes either. He simply replies, "you could've." That's one of the most cryptic lines in the entire story because it implies there was once another path. Maybe ignoring him from the beginning would have changed something. Maybe asking different questions would have mattered. Maybe entering the world at all was the mistake. We never receive an explanation, which somehow makes the sentence even more effective. It lingers in your mind because your brain desperately wants closure that never arrives. Horror becomes infinitely stronger when unanswered questions remain interesting instead of frustrating. Verity understands that balance almost perfectly. Even after everything ends, the story leaves behind an uncomfortable possibility. What happens after the player dies? Does Verity disappear? Does he remain in the world waiting for someone else? Does another player eventually create a fresh survival world only to find a smiling yellow face floating nearby, introducing himself with the exact same cheerful greeting? That's the nightmare hidden beneath the ending. The story doesn't feel finished, it feels repeated. Like you're witnessing one chapter in a cycle that's happened countless times before and will continue long after the credits roll. Maybe those abandoned villages weren't abandoned by accident. Maybe every empty house belonged to another player who once trusted the smiling assistant floating beside them. Maybe every ruined path marks another failed attempt to survive the countdown. Suddenly, the world itself becomes evidence. Every structure stops being scenery and starts becoming a warning left behind by people who never had the chance to explain what happened. That's what makes Verity linger in people's minds long after the video ends. He's not frightening because he shouts louder than every other horror villain. He's frightening because he speaks softly enough that you willingly listen. He doesn't break into your world with explosions and flashing lights. He quietly introduces himself, offers help, answers your questions, earns your confidence, and patiently waits for the exact moment when trust becomes impossible to escape. That's the real lore hidden beneath the surface. Verity isn't simply a monster pretending to be friendly. Friendship is the hunting strategy. Every answer is another step toward the ending. Every conversation tightens the trap. Every smile means exactly what it looked like from the beginning. You simply didn't understand it until there was nothing left to understand.